So recently on YouTube, someone asked me to explain why George Pickens is the biggest sell in Dynasty, and I'm not sure he is, but also I'm not sure he isn't. I'm generally out, and we'll come to where I'm valuing and what I'm doing with that in a second, but I want to explain why that comment turned up, and why George Pickens is a very polarizing player from the 2022 rookie draft. Essentially one of the most popular, one of the best ways of looking for rookie breakouts or sophomore breakouts is to look at how often they were earning targets relative to the number of routes they were playing. I prefer principally to combine it with looking at how many routes they're earning relative to their team's overall volume as well, and I think that creates better tiers. George Pickens had an 800-yard season. Players who have 800 yards in their rookie season typically go on to do well. Those who don't are typically explained by touchdown regression, like Chase Claypool or Kelvin Benjamin, or even Torrey Smith back in the day, or they're explained by injuries and missed time and trades, like Jordan Matthews and Justin Blackmon actually ends up on that list. So the first thing I want to tell you about George Pickens is he's one of 4 players who actually had over 800 yards in 2022 as a rookie. And you shouldn't give it away for just anything, because they're relatively rare and there's a relatively strong hit percentage of players who go on to have at least one top 24 season before the story is written. The other thing you should know is that you shouldn't give it away for nothing, because the value is unlikely to disappear entirely. Jordan Matthews, for example, had 3 years with over 800 yards, and he was still tradable in that 3rd year by the time he was traded, and then eventually tried to transition to tight end or whatever. Or another better example, right now, Jerry Jeudy had over 800 yards in his rookie season. We're 3 years in, we're yet to see the full payoff of what PFF, his routes run, and everyone who likes watching routes and saying how good routes are and how much hip swivel players have, actually transition into fantasy points, and yet still with positive signal from the quarterback position and a potential regression or improvement or return back to the norm for Russell Wilson in Denver, there is still a strong buy Jerry Jeudy window in Dynasty. So sell George Pickens based on his targets per route run relative to his team's overall volume? Yes, but don't panic sell it, and certainly don't do it for anything, because that 800 yards is fairly significant. If we look at the few players who had good overall route percentages, like George Pickens, over 20% of his overall team's routes in 2022, but a below average targets per route run, so he's earning targets relatively poorly on the routes he was running. There are exceptions. One of the biggest exceptions is DeAndre Hopkins, who did a relatively similar thing in his rookie season. Those who are exceptions, who go on to do well despite that mark, tend to have significant target competition in their rookie season. DeAndre Hopkins had Andre Johnson in his rookie season, for example. Devontae Adams, another exception to players who go on to do well despite disappointing rookie seasons, had Jordy Nelson and Randall Cobb on his team in his rookie season, who both combined for over 2,800 yards together. I just like throwing that one out because it's still impressive and still awesome. So George Pickens having a below average targets per route run number, or struggling to earn targets per route, might be a product for having Pat Freiermuth and Deontay Johnson on the same team. Now, while they're not Jordy Nelson and Randall Cobb, they are significant target competition relative to most rookie seasons. Having said that, the question essentially boils down to how likely is it that George Pickens is DeAndre Hopkins, and the answer to any comparison to DeAndre Hopkins is probably bad. It's probably not very likely. How do these two players compare in their rookie seasons outside of that? Actually, relatively well. Both Hopkins and Pickens had less than 1.4 yards per route run, just in case you believe in that magical number. Both players had significant target share, but not above average target share, with around 14% of the team's overall targets. Both players had over 20% of the team's overall routes, so the number of routes the team ran entirely, they ran a route on 20% of those opportunities? Yeah. Both players also earned targets at a relatively low rate of 14%. In other words, they earn a target on 14% of the routes they ran, which is the problem. Both players also had below average points per game in their rookie season. DeAndre Hopkins and George Pickens both had about 9 points per game in PPR scoring. There's a lot of similarities, including the fact that both were running an ADOT over 13, I think. George Pickens' ADOT was 14 and DeAndre Hopkins' ADOT was 13. So yeah, relatively consistently. The principal difference, in fact, is that George Pickens played one extra game in a 17-game season. DeAndre Hopkins played all his games, 16, but in a season that didn't run for 17 games, so he couldn't possibly have that extra season. The other principal difference is that George Pickens had a touchdown for every 165 yards he scored. In other words, he had 4 touchdowns. DeAndre Hopkins had 2. which put him around 400 yards per touchdown, which is below average. Yards per touchdown is actually a stat that regresses relatively consistently and relatively accurately to predict touchdown regression. DeAndre Hopkins should have had more touchdowns in his rookie season. George Pickens doesn't have that, and he also had an extra game to get to that 800-yard barrier and to earn all those routes on that 20% of his team's overall route percentage. While there certainly isn't a black mark against George Pickens, it does show that DeAndre Hopkins and George Pickens are not a very clear comparison if you're looking for a reason to believe that George Pickens' below average targets per route run number is not negative. Is there a window? Yeah, I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Kenny Pickett, but I do know the one thing he did in college was take full advantage of a great receiver in Jordan Addison before Jordan Addison left the team. That's essentially when Kenny Pickett racked up all his stats. So he knows how to do that. He's got a good supporting cast with Deontay Johnson and Pat Freiermuth. Hold your tongue, he's good. And he could definitely surpass a lot of expectations. I don't see a lot of upside in that offense with that quarterback, with very likely fewer touchdowns scored in general, and George Pickens isn't due touchdown regression, so we can't expect more points for the same level of opportunity that he got in his rookie season. So 2023 boils down to 3 players. It's Garrett Wilson, it's Chris Olave, and it's Drake London. Those are the 3 players we should really be targeting in Dynasty in general without many qualms. Below that, you have a tier of Christian Watson, who we've talked about before, and George Pickens. Personally, I prefer George Pickens because his targets per route run number can improve, and the exceptions in that number, especially when they showed other good signal, which George Pickens did, and it's not really DeAndre Hopkins level, but it's not DeAndre Hopkins level, should be considered exceptions to the general rule. George Pickens isn't Alec Pierce. He's also not, I think he will get more targets per routes that he runs, but I just don't see a DeAndre Hopkins level upside, which is what he would need to actually improve his value. Instead, I think he's more Jordan Matthews or Jerry Jeudy and should hold steady in his value through 2023. But that's my George Pickens take. I think he is a strong sell, but do it with caution, because I don't think his value is going to go anywhere. I don't think his targets per route run number means he's not going to be a big part of this offense, and I don't think everyone's going to entirely give up on him just because 2023 isn't going to be an explosion of DeAndre Hopkins-like production. But let me know what you think. Thanks very much for checking out the video, and I will see you in the next one.